What do you make of the manosphere's claim that women's liberation has led to our weakened ability to pair bond, the breakdown of the institution of marriage, and sexual inequity in favor of alpha men? Well, I guess probably I would say that to the degree that all of that is true, I wouldn't say that the women's liberation movement is what's done it, because I don't believe that the women's liberation movement is the primary driver of women's liberation. In fact, I think it's a secondary consequence of a far more radical biological revolution, and that's the invention of the birth control pill. Right? Because the birth control pill essentially allowed females for the first time in evolutionary history to gain voluntary control over their reproductive function. And a tremendous amount of political upheaval followed in the aftermath of that. And, people who were engaged in that political upheaval like to think about it as causal, because they like to think that their efforts, say, on agitating in favor of women's equal rights, it was actually the causal factor that produced the sociological transformation. But I think the evidence for that is extraordinarily weak, given the unbelievable magnitude of the birth control pill. So, with the birth control pill, women become more like men, much more like men. And also, it seems to be the case that women on the birth control pill don't like masculine men as much. There's studies showing that, for example, if you show women the face of the same man at different, or the same men at different phases of their ovulatory cycle, and all you do is widen the jaw or narrow the jaw of the men, that the women at the peak of their ovulation, where they're maximally fertile, like the wide-jawed men better, but when they're infertile, they like the narrow-jawed men better, and wider-jawed men have higher levels of testosterone, and the pill mimics infertility. And so, we don't know what these radical biological hormonal transformations have done to the relationship between men and women. And women too are trying to experiment with their new mode of being. It's like, well, now they're not destined at an early age to transform themselves into mothers, or to allow themselves to be transformed by nature into mothers, even though it's possible that they might be much happier if that happened. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but there is good evidence that women's general level of unhappiness has increased since the early 1960s. So, anyways, what has been the consequence of that? Well, the first consequence was wild sexual experimentation. And why not? What would you expect? It's like all of a sudden reproduction's under control. Does that mean that women can be as promiscuous as men? Well, maybe that's what it means. We don't know. So that was part of the big 60s experiment, and it isn't obvious that went particularly well. It certainly led to the pornographication of our society, which I really think is actually quite dreadful. Maybe that's my innate prudishness, but I don't know. It seems to me that pornography demeans the participants as well as the viewers. There's something second-rate and furtive about it, and I think that everybody who engages in it knows that. It's a substitute for the real adventure of life, and I do think that it leads to a certain kind of perhaps contempt. It leads to contempt, I would say, and that can't be a good thing. I mean, I don't ever think. And you guys can ask yourself this question. I mean, have you ever met anybody who finished masturbating and then was proud about it, and who stood up straighter because of it, and who felt that they'd really conquered life as a consequence? I mean, I just don't believe that's the general post-masturbation feeling. I don't believe that. I believe that it's like it's something you do when you don't have the right thing to do, and it's an admission that you're a second-rate player, essentially, something like that. So the pornographication was a bad thing. The fact that, women's lives have been complicated too, I would say, by this transformation too, because it isn't easy now for women to decide that they want to make being a mother a primary focus of their life, because increasingly it's necessary for families to have two incomes. And I think the reason for that, there's two reasons for that. One is that when women started to flood into the labor market was approximately the same time that the market started to open to places like India and China, and working wages started to flatten. But then you also have the fact that if you double the labor pool by introducing women into it, perhaps you half the value of labor, and that might, maybe you do even worse than that. If women are more agreeable and more likely to work part-time and more willing to take lesser hours and lower pay, which seems to be the case, then maybe you flatten the labor market even more. So in terms of increasing sexual inequity in favor of alpha men, well, anything that breaks down pair bonding, matrimony is going to do that, because sexual access for males is a Pareto distributed phenomena, where a small proportion of the males get most of the invitations, let's say. And the thing that is a bulwark against that is monogamy. And part of the reason that societies are set up to be monogamous is so that that proclivity is controlled, because it's not good for children, let's say, if they don't have access to a father, and it's not good for women if they're all competing for the same men, and then it's not good for the men who aren't being chosen because they're not being chosen. And so that just seems to be a recipe for resentment and an aggression, and I think the evolutionary psychology data on that's pretty clear. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's women's liberation, it's the birth control pill. And don't underestimate the significance of the birth control pill. It's like the hydrogen bomb or the computer chip. It's a world revolutionary technology, and for all we know, it might do us in. In the West, the birth rate is far below replacement, and that's as a multi-generational strategy, that's an absolute dead end. And of course, no one can talk about that because, well, for the obvious reasons of egalitarianism and diversity and all of that. But the declining birth rate in the West is really, I would say, a catastrophe. I don't happen to be one of those people who think the planet has too many people on it, so